In your third lecture in the Constitution is a Solution series, Constitutional Economics, Constitutional Money, you describe there that according to the Constitution, only gold and silver is legal tender, and you discuss the need for abolishing the Federal Reserve System. How could we go about abolishing the Federal Reserve without destroying the American economy in the process?
That's a great question. I often compare this to doing a heart transplant because the Federal Reserve monetary system really is the heart of our economy in our country today. And so we can't just remove it and expect our economy to survive that drastic of a move. There's a great proposal that is starting to be implemented in some of the states already, where they incrementally start moving that state more and more towards obeying the Constitution by using gold and silver coinage. The first step, which we've seen implemented in Utah, and I think maybe one or two other states have started doing this as well, the first step is to recognize gold and silver coin is money. Therefore, it's not a taxable event when I exchange my Federal Reserve paper money for a gold or silver coin. That's just exchanging the same thing as a $20 bill for 2 tenths, one form of currency for another. Number two, they start accepting this coinage as tender and payment of debts. You can pay your taxes and they'll recognize it as its value if you pay in silver or gold. Then the next step that needs to be implemented is you take a portion of the state budget and set it aside in gold and silver coinage, a small portion to begin with. And then as various vendors that receive payments from the state government, any that want to can choose to be paid in the gold and silver coinage rather than in the Federal Reserve notes. What this does is it starts a large entity circulating and using gold and silver coinage as money again. And then as the demand increases, then the state increases the portion of their state budget for which they're using gold and silver coinage. When you have a large enough entity that's doing that, then the small shops in town as well can put on their store window, we accept gold and silver coinage here as well as regular money. They start pricing things in both forms. This costs $20 or one silver coin or whatever that way.
So you said that some states have already started to implement this this use of gold and silver at least on a limited basis for now?
Yes, that's right. They've done the first step, declaring that gold and silver coin is money. It's not a sales taxable item, and that it's acceptable to be used as payment in debts to the state.
You mentioned also earlier in your answer that individuals can choose to have their payments received from the state in either gold or silver coinage as well. Doesn't that create the potential for there being a drain on the state's gold and silver supply then?
Not so much. There's plenty of gold and silver that can be purchased for that process. So that's not really the concern as far as quantity of coinage. The other factor there is as it becomes more used, yes, the value of it increases. And so based on supply and demand, of course, that determines the value of the coin. But the real issue here is the supply and demand for the coin. You start creating a competing currency. You have the Federal Reserve note, which inevitably will eventually inflate. It's already inflated quite a bit through its lifespan. And eventually will go to the point where it becomes worthless like all other paper eventually does. If we, at this point, start putting in competing currencies that don't have inflationary nature to them, like gold and silver, if you get the state operating a major portion of their budget on non-inflation prone currency, like gold and silver, if at that point you have a rampant, out of control inflation, hyperinflation of the Federal Reserve note, if enough people are using the coinage, they're insulated from that out-of-control market that happens.
So essentially, states that are practicing this could help shield them from any ramifications of bad policy done in Washington or at the Fed, essentially.
Precisely. The more they have transitioned their economy to solid money, the less impact the inflation will have on them.
And eventually, if you have these competing currencies going on, Federal Reserve notes versus the gold and silver coins, eventually one's going to come out on top or become the more dominant one. And in those states, you'll probably see eventually over time, it wouldn't happen overnight, obviously, or maybe even in a few years, but perhaps over a period of several decades, perhaps you might see little to no use of the Federal Reserve notes in those states, at least.
And the way this program is designed to be implemented, it's very market driven. That they're not imposing, just suddenly shifting the entire state economy to gold and silver coinage. Start with a small amount, and then based on demand, they increase it to anticipate the next year's demand for the budget. How much did people ask for gold and silver coin to be paid to them from the state budget? And as that increases, they increase that portion until hopefully eventually that's what's being demanded. People want real money rather than these Federal Reserve notes. Then it does eventually replace it.
So similarly, with the Federal Reserve at large, rather than switching overnight from gold to gold and silver
from the Federal Reserve
from the Federal Reserve system, this process at the state level that you're discussing is a gradual one. So that's how we would get rid of the Federal Reserve ultimately, gradually through gold and silver in different states. And if more states adopt that, eventually the Federal Reserve will phase itself out through that method, is what you're essentially saying.
It would be forced to be phased out by the vote of the people. And again, this comes down to people understanding the need for solid currency. There has to be some basis of understanding, and of course that'll start out small. But as people recognize this currency is much more stable, a good supply of good money has the tendency to drive out bad money if it's properly implemented. There's also the reverse that can be true, that if I have the choice to spend good money or bad money, I'm going to want to spend the bad money and keep the good money. And so there has to be a way to...
But of course, eventually retailers would probably want to accept the bad money as much as the good gold.
It's going to cost you a lot more if you're using the bad money, for example.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some natural market drivers that can help this happen. It really comes down to people recognizing the problem and the solution to it being gold and silver. But it also comes down to, as we see more problems with the Federal Reserve note, it'll naturally cause people to look to better currency.
So this sounds like a healthy and gradual way to transition us, avoiding the ramifications that you would hear from the naysayer prognosticators who say you can't get rid of the Fed because it'll cause all this ramifications and great storms in the economy. This approach, we don't know how long it would take, but by the time it's all eventually all done, it's gradual and you won't have this turbulent shift in the economy, essentially.
Right, and that's really the only way to avoid the massive impact of suddenly ending the Fed.